Okay, so chapter 29, plant diversity, part 1, how plants colonize land. Few characteristics to remember about plants is that they are eukaryotes, that they are autotrophs, they have a cell wall made of cellulose, think celery, right? Okay, so about 385 million years ago, some plants were actually able to grow taller, right? So things got a little more complex. Now plants are found everywhere except for the harshest climates. You're talking about the tops of the mountains, polar regions, desert areas, right? Extreme desert areas. And there's about 290,000 species of plants that have been identified. This is your honeydew, your classic cacti, and the hostas. I love the hostas. They're such pretty, colorful plants, but they really like shape. All right, this chapter traces the first 100 million years of plant evolution. The seedless plants, like the mosses and ferns. So we're talking about the itty bitty ones, right? The short ones, okay? Because they did not have any vascular tissue. They did not have any xylem, which carries the water, and they did not have any phloem, which carries the food, the glucose. Your charophytes are the closest relatives of all land plants. You need to know that, you need to know that, you need to know that. I'm going to say it again. The charophytes are the closest relatives of all land plants. That is on your quiz and on your test, okay? Plants are multicellular, eukaryotic, photosynthetic autotrophs. Their cell walls are made of cellulose, remember, think celery, and they have chloroplast, and a cell wall, of course, we did mention it. They're shared, these characteristics are shared with brown, red, green algae, your dinoflagellates, remember dino, think red tide, dino's dead, red tide kills, and euglenids. But only the charophytes share these 4 characteristics with the land plants. You've got rings of cellulose synthesizing proteins, because if they're going to have a cell wall of cellulose, it's got to be made somehow. That's the proteins who do that. The peroxisomes are going to help minimize the loss of your organic products through photorespiration. So when the plant closes the stomata, right, to minimize water loss when it gets really hot, no CO2 enters. So the process to produce carbon dioxide is going to be limited, but no ATP is made. They do have a flagellate sperm. This is important because this is something that's going to disappear as plants evolve or complex. And there's a formation of a phragmoplast, which is these little microtubules that work together between the daughter nuclei to form the cell plate during cytokinesis, right? During the cell cycle, so that we go from one cell with 2 nuclei to 2 cells with 1 nuclei each. That's what we're showing right here, is the cell plate forming during cytokinesis of plants. And this is Volvox. I got a little video for Volvox for y'all. It's very calming. It's very much like nature's lava lamp, if you will. Okay, I really like these guys. But anyways, so adaptations enabling the move from the ocean to land. Sporophyllidin, this prevents your exposed zygotes from drying out. This goes back to our chapter on cells, where we were looking at the electron microscope. I don't know if you guys have a guess to what we're looking at right here. But that's actually pollen, right? All these spikes to it, and that's why when it kind of gets inhaled, it irritates the immune system. Plants have a similar adaptation in tough spore pollen walls of plant spores, which allows the plants to live permanently above the waterline, away from water, because the number one thing plants have to overcome is desiccation, that drying out, okay? The kingdom Plantae are embryophytes. Technically, they are plants with embryos, all right? So, one of the things that plants have is what we call alternation generation. We touched on this when we talked about the meiosis. Here's the best way to explain it, all right? We have unicellular haploid, sperm and egg, right? Then normally we go straight to the sperm and the egg fertilize and becomes unidiploid, unicellular diploid organism. Then we go through mitosis, and it becomes a multicellular diploid organism. And they produce unicellular haploid because it's your sperm and your egg. This is your typical animal cell cycle. Plants have an extra step. So, unihap, multi-hap, multicellular haploid. Double checking that we remember that haploid means you have 1 set of chromosomes. So if we were talking about human, for example, that would be 23. Multicellular haploid, still 23 chromosomes if we're talking about human, but of course we're not. because we don't have this stage, right? But it would be 23. Then uni-dip, we're going to double it, so that would be 2N. So if it was human, it would be 46, but just made of one cell. And multicellular diploid, it would still be 46 because it would be 2N. This is what we call alternation of generation. So remember, I wrote this in green because this is what plants do. They have an alternation of generation. So the zygote is going to be retained in the female gametophyte. Your gametophyte is your multicellular haploid, okay? And it provides sugar and amino acids to the embryo. The embryo is also going to have placental transfer cells, which is going to allow the nutrients to go to the plant embryo as it's growing inside the seed, making plants known as embryophytes, which is just like us, eutherians, right? Placental animals, where basically we're supporting the entire development of the embryo. Walled spores produce in sporangia. Your sporangia is your multicellular organ that's going to produce your spores, and your sporocytes are the mother cells that are going to go through meiosis and generate the spores so that they can be carried on and reproduce. Okay, this is one of the things that's in the lab, right? Your multicellular gametangia. So, gametangia, multicellular, where the gametes are produced, and your archegonia, so egg, how you remember it. The female gametangia, this is where you actually have the egg that's being kept, and if you remember your parts of your flowers, this right here that produces the pollen is called the anther. Well, antheridia is how we remember that the antheridia is the male part and the archegonia egg is the female part. All right, so the antheridia is going to have the sperm with the flagellum. That's why your mosses are going to need that dew in the morning, right? So the sperm can actually swim over and come in and fertilize the egg in the archegonia. The egg is fertilized in the archegonium and the zygote develops into the embryo there as well. Apical meristem. All right, stem cells in animals are cells that can become anything. They are not specialized at all. So meristem cells are stem cells in plants. And your apical meristem cells are the ones that are at the roots and at the shoots, at the tips, okay? Instead of roots and shoots, they'll spread by apical meristem, localized regions at the tips. In the roots, the apical meristem cells will become part of the epidermis because it's either going to be root cells or root hairs. And in the shoots, that's where we come to the leaves. Oopsie. The cuticle. Remember, the number one thing plants had to overcome when they left the water was desiccation, right? So one of the adaptations they have is having this cuticle, which is this waxy covering that's going to protect the epidermis and prevent desiccation, prevent water loss. The mycorrhizae are a symbiotic relationship between fungi and the plants to increase nutrient absorption. So these are good fungi, allow the plants to get more out of the soil. But what happens, if you come by and you sprinkle an antifungal on there, it's going to kill the mycorrhizae, which means your plant's not going to have as much growth. Okay? So not something we want to do on plants. Secondary compound, we've talked about this. That's going to be your, I'm looking for my cloves. So your cloves, like the cloves that you put in oranges, I don't know if you guys do that for Christmas, but to get that nice Christmas smell. Also really great to make a really nice pumpkin pie. Your nutmeg, your cinnamon, all these things are what we call secondary compounds. And that's the product of a secondary metabolic pathway that can produce lots of different things. A lot of them are supposed to have bitter taste. Mint is another great example. It's really supposed to have a bitter taste. So the predators, i.e. the herbivores, don't eat the plants. Unfortunately for the plants, we've figured out a way to use them as spices and also in our medicines. So the origin and diversification of plants, that's when we started developing vascular tissue, right? Vascular tissue, I always kind of tap my arm because I think of my veins and my arteries. So the vascular tissue in plants, the xylem carries the water, so xylem goes from the soil up the entire plant. The phloem is going to go from the leaves, where most of photosynthesis occurs, carry the glucose down the plant, store it in the roots, until it's needed, and then it's going to bring it back up from the roots. So xylem only goes up, phloem goes down and up. It can reverse. It's what we call a source to sink situation, okay? Your vascular plants have this tissue, which is allows them to get really, really tall. Non-vascular plants, also known as bryophytes, that's your mosses, your liverworts, and your hornworts. So your mosses, your liverworts, and your hornworts, okay? Vascular plants are made of 3 different clades. Remember, clade are phylogenetic groups in the phylogenetic tree. You got the lycophytes, your club mosses, your seedless plants, your theraphytes, your ferns, your seedless, and then you've got your seed plants. That seed is an embryo that has a supply of nutrients, so kind of like a yolk, just like you would in a chicken egg, all right? That's going to have a protective coat around it because, again, the number one thing we've got to make sure we don't do is we do not want to dry out. Your gymnosperms are your naked seeds. These are your conifers, your cone-bearing trees. Okay, so we're talking about, the lycophytes, you've got the club mosses, the ferns, and the seed plants, which is going to be both of these. The gymnosperms are your cone-bearing, so pine tree would be a great example, right? And your angiosperm are your flowering plants. 90% of all living plants are actually angiosperms because this is an amazing way for reproduction. So great adaptation that allowed for extreme survival and diversification aplenty. Mosses are common, but sometimes we call something a moss when it actually is not a moss. The Spanish moss in our region is actually not a true moss. It's a flowering plant. The haploid gametophyte is dominant in our simpler plants, but as we go from the simple to the vascular plants, the more complex, there's actually a reduction in the gametophyte, so the multicellular hap, and there's an increase in size of the sporophyte, so the multicellular diploid, okay? So haploid goes smaller, diploid goes bigger. Gametophyte gets smaller, and sporophyte gets bigger. Your rhizoids are these long tubular cells that will actually anchor the bryophyte down. It's not a tissue like roots, it's just the cells working together. And then you've got the stomata, which are the holes on the bottom of your leaf that are going to open or close to allow the oxygen and carbon dioxide both in and out. Because remember, yes, plants photosynthesize, so they take in CO2 and they make their own food, and that's great. But not only do you need to make the food, you now need to convert it into usable cellular energy, ATP. So we've got to go through cellular respiration. So then they need to release the carbon dioxide that they have produced through cellular respiration. So they take in oxygen, take in carbon dioxide, release oxygen, release carbon dioxide, depending on which process they're going through. And that all happens through the stomata. The singular of the stomata is stoma, okay? So that's what these are right here, really nice. Your peat is your decayed organic material that is used for energy in Europe and Asia, and is still very common today in Ireland, Canada, great for soil. Soundproofing too, it's actually pretty good. Our vascular plants evolved in Devonian and Carboniferous periods about 350 million years ago. The sporophyte is dominant. Like I said, the gametophyte is reduced. The sporophyte is dominant because now we're in our more complex plants. You've got roots, which are the organs that are set up for absorbing nutrients and water. Our leaves, which are going to increase the surface area to photosynthesize, right? And we think one of the reasons the ice age happened, right? So let's take a step back. Currently, we have excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Based on that, the planet is getting warmer, climate change, because everything's kind of out of whack. Well, what we think happened is that the carbon dioxide levels decreased so fast because there was such a successful boom of plants right before the ice age, during the Carboniferous period, that we think it sucked down the carbon dioxide levels so fast it actually led to the ice age. And that's it for this chapter.